Milt sent a letter to the city of Stuttgart and asked if they would give him any information on his relatives who had lived in Untertürkheim and Obertürkheim. Before long, he had a response that said they had forwarded his letter to the area and someone would be in contact with him.
"Who's Gertrude?" our son Rich asked. We stood, the four of us, Rich and his wife Kristen, Gary and I, in the small cemetery at the west edge of Panora, Iowa. 4 smaller markers flanked the large Bachelet headstone. They marked the graves of my grandparents, Joshua Earl Bachelet, Beatrice King Bachelet, their daughter, my Aunt Beth, and one more, Gertrude. Yes, Gertrude. Seldom mentioned, but a part of our family history. Who was Gertrude?
I love to sing. My mom and I sang duets together when I was not yet 5. She taught me a good many tunes from the 30s and 40s, and you may find this hard to believe, but I could sing harmony to all of them. By the time I was 6, I was so sure of myself that I rang people's doorbells and sang on their doorsteps. My name most likely appeared on the watch list of future loonies, but singing was as easy and as natural to me as breathing and laughing.
This is a memoir written in December of 2015 titled My Mother, Myself. Seldom a day goes by that I'm not reminded of my mother's influence in my life.
We had 3 postcards that Milt's dad had received years ago. One was from the Googlers, who wrote from a small town called Fellbach. So we made a reservation at a small hotel in Fellbach for our first night, and one in Rotenburg for the second night. He also had a postcard with a picture of a Weinkeller or winery in Untertürkheim, and one with a church. We took those with us on the trip. Ludwig was the youngest brother of Milt's grandfather. He was only a baby when the older brothers immigrated to the United States, so he stayed in Germany.
She was active in Eastern Star, Tri-T, Church Circle, and area women's clubs, always with a sense of duty to others. Neighbor kids were welcome and found cookies and fun when they came by.
Yes, I have always been able to harmonize, but I have a limited range of notes that I can hit with assurance that make a pleasant sound. Being a second alto pretty much allows me to navigate most musical scores comfortably, but there are a few sadistic composers who throw in a few high notes for low voices.
A mother and daughter who was sitting nearby could speak English, so they conversed with us. Milt showed them the postcards of the winery and the church and asked them if they knew anything about them. Both buildings were within 2 blocks of where we were eating there. When we went upstairs to our rooms for the night, John came over and said, "Dad, there's someone on the phone who wants to talk to you." When Milt answered, he said, "I cannot understand you." He returned to our room, but shortly John came back again, and this time it was a woman's voice, and she said, "We think we are related. Can you come down tomorrow?"
One Christmas, not too long ago, our church choir, along with choirs from other downtown churches, put on a lovely Christmas cantata. We worked on the music for months, and when the evening of the performance came, we were 90 strong and sang our hearts out. The music was gorgeous, though it had many very high alto parts that I lip-synced and yet let a more talented Methodist or Presbyterian carry my load.
Mother was not a procrastinator, a trait that is essentially positive in my life. She displayed a take-charge attitude and got right to the job. I tackle chores and projects quickly, so I'll be free to take on the next challenge. During my angst of adolescence, with late nights, dates, and temptations, the only admonition was, "We trust you." I remember several times when those words had more effect on my conscience than curfews and other ground rules. Maybe having 2 sons before me proved the futility of rules to keep a 3rd child out of trouble. I often heard, "What would people think?" A reminder of how my behavior could reflect on the family.
A yellowed clipping in a family scrapbook tells of a happy day in the life of my grandfather and Gertrude, his first wife. Just 3 years after this joyful union, Gertrude died at age 28. Cause of death, childbirth. Several years later, my grandfather married my grandmother, Beatrice King. Many years after that, when my grandmother was 87 years old and living in a nursing home, she wrote a letter to her daughter, my Aunt Beth, and revealed how Gertrude's death impacted their marriage and starting a family.
The cantata was a success, and people from the congregation lavished us with compliments. I accepted the praise as if I'd sung every note. A few weeks later, our choir director informed us that because we had sung so beautifully at the cantata, she wanted us to sing a piece from it at our Christmas Eve service. No one seemed to have any problem with that, and we rehearsed it with ease. As before, I could not reach the high notes, but a few of my compatriots could, so everything seemed right with the world.
When we returned home, we received a card from Annie's father with a picture of a little village nestled in the Swiss Alps. The card read, "Greetings from our holiday house in the Swiss Alps." Well, we thought maybe we had made a mistake. Then a letter arrived, and in it was a photo of Milt's mother and father and his 3 sisters with an Aunt Dora texter. The picture was taken in the backyard of Milt's parents' home in Burlington. Then we knew it was for real.
Coon Rapids, March 16, 1969. Dear daughter, do you remember anyone telling you Dad was married before me? It seems to me it was a Gertrude Thornburg, but not clear in my mind. He seldom ever mentioned it to me, and I didn't question him. It was about 4 years before we were married, so he was pretty faithful, and I think he thoroughly loved me, especially after we had you children. Funny how these things come to mind. I thoroughly loved him, and I think he did me, but I think losing Gertrude was hard on him. They had no children to tie them. I imagine it was childbirth that took her. He was reticent about me having children, but now, and even before, I was lucky to have such lovely, considerate children, and how he loved you both and me for having you. He was very kind and thoughtful of me. I knew early he was my man.
They had called every place there, and the last place was the hotel where they located us. Carl Melchinger had tried for years to contact the Burlington relatives, but the Second World War broke any ties.
It seemed Mom could always fix things or make them better. When I was in kindergarten, I decided to cut my hair before school one morning and realized too late what I had done. I recall coming downstairs for Mom to fix it, thinking she could do the impossible. She didn't scold me and somehow moved hair around to try and cover the shortest spots. I went on to school, having learned another lesson. Occasionally, Mom and I would get tickled about something, maybe watching I Love Lucy or Red Skelton. Something would strike us funny, and we'd plunge into an unabashed fit of laughter. I haven't succumbed to such unbridled fun in many years.
However, on Christmas Eve, we gathered at the back of the church before the service, and at least half of the choir was absent. To my sheer horror, I was the only alto. The rest of the choir consisted of a few string sopranos, 2 tenors, one of which had a hearing deficit, and a singular bass with a bad head cold. If there had been an opportunity, I would have thrown myself at our director's feet and begged her to let us get out of singing, but it was not to be. The prelude had begun, and it was on with the show. Our little troupe processed to the choir loft and waited for our time to come like condemned men and women. The director, who is also the pianist, began to play the melodic introduction, and as I looked at the congregation, I saw expectation on their faces. Many of them had enjoyed the cantata a few weeks prior and were looking forward to hearing the music again, poor souls.
He thoroughly loved you and King and me, and we had 42 years of happy life together. Funny how all this came back to me. Well, I hope someday you'll have such a good husband. Love, Mother.
Since that time, there have been numerous visits, but that's another story.
The predictable and stable atmosphere at home wasn't appreciated at the time, but now I realize what a blessing it was. Mom was always there when I came home from school, And Dad was always there for supper every night, if not for all 3 meals, since his work at our gas station was next door. Day-to-day conversations and sharing must have been monumental in shaping my self-image and life skills. I think society today is suffering the consequences of the lack of this traditional, nurturing home life.
We found that letter in my Aunt Beth's things last year after her death. I was touched by my grandmother's heartfelt, intimate thoughts, and it gave me new understanding of my grandparents. I had known that my grandpa's first wife had died in childbirth, but I had never considered the fear he must have felt about my grandma bearing children. Thankfully, they chose to, and my father, Carroll King Bachelet, was their firstborn in 1920. I love looking at pictures of my dad as a young child, and the vast number of pictures that were taken is testament to how delighted his parents were with him. That, too, was a revelation to me, because my grandparents, especially my grandfather, were somewhat reserved and not demonstrative. The love was there and felt, but I don't remember expressions of it aloud.
It has been 13 years since Mom died after gradually declining with dementia and being wheelchair-bound with arthritis. Having her nearby in Burlington at Klein's for 9 years after I retired allowed me to be with her almost daily. A month before her 95th birthday, as I sat at her bedside moistening her lips, holding her hand, and waiting for her lapse into coma, she turned slightly and looked at me with milky gray eyes and surprised me with her last words, "You're beautiful."
There really aren't words to describe the music, if that's what you could call it, that we delivered that night. I tried to hit the high notes, but what came out of my throat sounded more like a noon whistle. The tenors lost their place and the sopranos lost their courage. Our one bass sang like a trooper, albeit a very stuffed-up trooper. Before that piece ended, I came to the logical conclusion that our entire ensemble consisted of lip singers. We were the fakers, and our evening of reckoning had arrived. When the song Mercifully for Us was ended, our director, who normally smiled at us and mouthed "good job," lowered her head, refusing to look at us.
So back to that day in the cemetery when Rich posed his question, "Who's Gertrude?" Gravestones record names and dates, and sometimes generate questions. Thankfully, our family has the story that tells more, and Rich's question prompted me to record it.
No one ever speaks of this performance, but for those of us who sang that night, the experience is etched in our minds forever. From that Christmas Eve on, the choir has been relegated to leading the congregation and singing Christmas carols only. Our director solicits dependable soloists and instrumental ensembles instead. As for me, I love to sing, and I continue to be a faker. I know my limitations and lip sync with abandon when confronted with high notes. My noon whistle hasn't blown since that fateful Christmas Eve, and God willing, it will never sound again.